Welcome back to MONEV Podcast by MONEV Studio. For those who are new, you might be wondering what the MONEV Podcast is. Well, the MONEV Podcast is a discussion and learning channel about monitoring and evaluations, or MONEV, in a casual chat, covering up-to-date material on the concepts and practice of MONEV in development. In this episode, we will be talking about political economy analysis. We are joined here by Max Sibanda, our international associate at MONEV Studio, specializing in migration eval and PEA. Let's say hello to Max. Hello, Max. How are you doing?
Hello, Inaya. I'm fine. How are you? And thank you for having me and greetings to your listeners.
Thank you. I'm doing great. So, before jumping into the main session, let me introduce you to our speaker. Max Sibanda has an academic background in public policy analysis, local government, international migration, and development evaluation. Max is currently pursuing a PhD in migrant integration and development. He has substantial experience in research and teaching in all of those above fields. Max works with various private, public, and civil society entities in South Africa, consulting on various aspects ranging from rural development, youth development, and monitoring and evaluation. Through his education and work experience, Max is a competent development evaluation practitioner, an aspiring political economist, passionate about justice and socio-economic development, particularly in the Global South. Okay, now we are going into the first segment. Let's begin with the relevance of PEA for monitoring and evaluation in the context of policy development. Well, Max, what is political economy analysis and how useful is PEA for evaluators and policymakers?
Thanks for that question. And just to already mention upfront that PEA is a very useful tool in both policy development and also monitoring and evaluation. Having been introduced to the field or reintroduced to the field about 2 to 3 decades ago. PA has enabled a lot of implementation or implementability of projects and programs in places that it was otherwise not possible. So by analyzing different aspects that are key components of PEA, program and policy developers have been able to unlock the implementability of different programs and policies. And as evaluators, we also are able to utilize the tools of PEA to assess the evaluability of programs and to enable our clients to focus on various aspects that will make the program work or not work, or give them explanation in that regard. So having said that, what is political economy analysis? So there are different definitions or understanding of political economy analysis, because there are different tools under which this term, this umbrella term, political economy analysis applies. Yes, but essentially, when you're talking about political economy analysis, we are talking about the interaction between political processes and economic processes in shaping society, in shaping reality. So how do the processes of political or power dynamics interact with economic structures and incentives and institutions to create reality as we know it? How do they facilitate progress? How do they even hinder progress? So by disentangling those kind of interactions, using different tools or focusing on different areas. That's what we mean by political economy analysis. And of course, as you can imagine, there are different levels to it. You can look at it at a bigger level, at a country level. Some people even look at it at a regional level. And then you can also look at it at a meso level or a program policy or a sector level, or you can also look at it at a very local and problem-based level. So all this analysis is possible in these different levels. So yeah, that's how it is. That's why it is very useful for the evaluators, because it is very malleable. It is very flexible in how it can be used.
All right, thank you, Max. That's such a very good opening for all of us here. And now let's moving on into the next questions. So how does political economy analysis strengthen the causal logic of a policy theory of change?
Okay, so that is a very good question and very relevant, actually, when you talk about uh, poly, political economy analysis, because if we go back to the rationale why political economy analysis became relevant to development practitioners, especially starting with bigger international organizations like the DFID. It has been adopted also by the World Bank and other international development institutions. Initially, it started as an effort, as a tool, as a heuristic to understand the country dynamics. Because, as you can imagine, a lot of international development organizations are trying to bring change, are trying to bring progress or to transform areas that are outside of their jurisdictions, areas that they have little understanding. So the Department for International Development in the UK drafted this framework called Drivers of Change framework, in which they were trying to understand at the country level what are some of the drivers of change, what are some of the effects or some of the, how can I put this? Some of the areas that they should look at when they want to bring change. For example, who are the actors that are in that space, and what are they doing? What are their value systems? What are their incentives? What are their positions? What are their agencies? And then also look at the structure itself, right? The structure, we're looking at these long-term emplacements that sometimes are very hard to change. Looking also including power dynamics, how power is shared in those areas. And also, what are the rules of engagement? These are called institutions in political economy analysis. What are the rules of engagement? The formal rules from the constitution to the various sectoral laws, to also looking at the informal rules of engagement, the norms, the values, the expectations. So these big organizations wanted to understand this in order for them to be able to identify entry points for their development programs. That's why it was important for them to disentangle this, because they realized that beyond the technicality of programs, planning, the theories of change of their programs, if they don't understand the context, for example, if they don't understand who holds power where and how do they wield that power, they may not be able to realize the change. So that's why PEA was initially formed. So how does it strengthen the causal logic of policy theory of change? By validating assumptions, of course. By validating assumptions, because when you are planning a project, you are looking at technically this can work in this way, the logical flow of things, but you're also assuming a lot of things. You're assuming the behavior of institutions, you are assuming the behavior of individuals, that if individuals behave in this way or the other way, therefore our results are going to be achieved. PEA gets further into those assumptions and it validates them because it makes visible who the agents are and what value systems, what power do they wield, what agency do they hold, what are the institutions that are there or not there, and how can this impact on the planned program. And then, so the first one is validating assumptions. The second one is identifying entry points or what we call feasible pathways. For example, PEA does not only look at what should be done, it looks at what can be done, what realistically can be done, what is feasible in this context, right? So you realize that a project, for example, a youth development project or literacy improvement program that is set in different contexts is not going to be implemented in the same way because contexts differ, how agency interact with structural variables and institutional variables in different contexts differ. Therefore, the same program can be implemented differentially because the feasible pathways in different contexts then differ. And then we also look at the adaptive learning strategies. How can we learn as we implement our programs? So PEA helps us by identifying different elements of the context. It enables us to appreciate what we already know, but also to look at what can we learn. So I think those three aspects, validating assumptions, feasible pathways, and adaptive learning, these are some of the ways in which PEA strengthen the causal logic of policy theory of change.
All right, Max, that's a very complex and interesting answer to understand how PEA could strengthen the causal logic of a policy in TOC. Now, let's move on then. How does PEA help to identify binding constraints, incentives, and power relations that shape whether policy change is measurable?
Yes. Some of these answers, Inaya, could seem very repetitive, or rather, as they could be very related, because again, PA looks at these three broad components: the agents, the institutions, and the structure, right? So when you look at the constraints, identifying the constraints, this is the key aspect of PA, how to identify the constraints, because again, the history of development work was stagnating, 30 years or 40 years ago was stagnating because people were trying to be very technical with development, right? Until some scholars started saying, it's the politics, so we have to look also at the political dynamics, right? So in terms of binding constraints, of course, PA can help because it can identify, for example, look at the institutions. By institutions, I said, we mean the rules of the game. These are the official, the formal rules, the constitution, the laws in the country, but also the informal, right? And then you look at how agents interact with these rules, right? In some contexts, you may find that officially you have power holders, right? Political officials who are different places, but these people, they may not hold the relevant power that you need to make a certain change, certain policy or program change. right? There are other individuals, there are other actors, organizations, and individuals that hold power, but they are not visible in the formal structure, in the formal organogram, right? So PEA helps you unlock these informal power networks so that you can then look at who is constraining this progress, who does not want this change to happen, right? So diagnostic focus, right? So PEA will help you with that diagnostic focus to say, apart from what is visible, what is invisible that can actually help with implementing this program or this policy, and how can I design my program? How can I design the M&E framework in order for me to capture and monitor this invisible network of power relations and influence, and how communication works, right? And again, to what can be measured, right? You can realize that in a number of contexts, sometimes what can be measured is political. Data is political because there are certain individuals, there are certain actors that don't want certain things to be traced, to be monitored, to be measured. So they will resist. And some of these individuals, unfortunately, they occupy power structures or levers of power in which they can actually block certain aspects being followed, being measured, being monitored, right? So as an M&E aspect, with the tools of PEA, you can be sensitive to these dynamics. You can be sensitive to these dynamics and then cleverly design your monitoring framework in such a way that you still capture the dynamics of these invisible institutional networks without really triggering a lot of pushback from these power holders. So that's how I can say this how PEA can help identify finding constraints, and but by really being diagnostic, being identifying these invisible, and then designing around them in a very creative way.
All right. To design is actually to learn and to see what's going on here. Okay, Max, let's move on into the second segment. So PEA is important in shaping and assessing measurable evidence. Therefore, what are the main challenges in applying PEA to public policy design or for its implementations or in evaluation itself?
So the main challenges in applying PEA is that, of course, PEA is objective is to make visible how the political structure interacts with the economic structure to influence the social structure, right? So some of these things, as we've already acknowledged, some of these networks of interactions are invisible, right? They are invisible, sometimes intentionally so, because they are designed to be invisible, right? There's certain, and when you're looking at policy change, when you're looking at programs, you are looking at problems, right? You're looking at trying to find solutions to problems. And it is said sometimes to acknowledge that where there are problems, there are also beneficiaries. And sometimes beneficiaries of problems are politically connected, are political elite of this context, and they resist this transformation of this context to remove these problems, because from these problems they benefit, right? That's why sometimes it's very difficult when you're trying to unearth these networks of power, invisible networks of power, how power is being wielded to affect economic and social realities. Those people that wield that power, sometimes they may resist. So the political will may not be there to really make explicit, make visible, all the dynamics that you need to know, all the contextual realities that one needs to know. So as evaluators, you are not really power wielders. You don't really have the political power most of the time, right, to really unlock these constraints, these binding constraints. So at the end of the day, your access to certain areas, to certain nodes of information is denied. So I think that's one of the main reasons why it's very difficult sometimes to apply PEA in public policy analysis, even in implementation, because implementation sometimes also talks to resources, how resources are being used to realize program and policy goals. Sometimes when the resources are involved, there's some people that are incentivized maybe to channel resources in this or the other way. So those networks, how these resources are being used, the reports and the records sometimes cannot be easily accessible for you to really trace these networks, these influences, and these incentives. So that's how I would answer this question.
Yeah, thank you, Max, for telling us about the challenges in applying PEA, especially the contexts are sometimes, like you mentioned before, its objectivity, its feasibility, and so on. Therefore, from your experience, so what types of indicators best that can capture political, institutional, or behavioral change identified in a PEA-informed TOC?
Yeah. In terms of indicators, because at the end of the day, I said PA talks about what is feasible, what can actually be done, what can be actually achieved, right? So with regards to indicators, I identified about three sets of indicators that one can use to capture this. The first one is the process, to try and map out these process coalition indicators, for lack of a better word. So to try and map out this stakeholder engagement, how stakeholders are engaging, and how coalitions are formed, both at the visible level, but also at the latent level, right? So these could be one set of indicators that one can measure to look at, stakeholder engagement and coalition formations, And then the other one is to look at incentives and implementation indicators, right? Tracking somehow, right? If you could find tracking the losers and winners of certain projects and policies, right? Who stands to gain what? Who stands to lose what? What are their incentives, right? So if you are managing to map out this, I think you can then also have this PEA informed TOC. And then the other one is the last one is this what I call sequencing or timing indicators that looks at milestones tied to reform windows, enabling rules and negotiated trade-offs, right? So to look at what is achieved when, what is achievable when, right? So so all this, of course, is connected, right? To look at the coalitions that are being formed, and because the context is not static, the context shifts with time, And as a big program or project or policy is being implemented, there is a lot of shifting of agents and shifting of institutions and slowly, gradually shifting of structures. And how are these shifting with time? So these, of course, these are kind of like a high-level indicators that one can try and implement.
All right, Max. So we move on to the third segment. So let's dive into your journey in monitoring and evaluation. Now, how would you balance ethical consideration, analytical transparency, and political sensitivity in evaluation?
Yeah, this is a very a difficult one. Yeah, this is a very difficult one. Like I say, there's a lot of pushback when you're trying to make visible certain aspects of how the context work, how institutions are being utilized, how agents use power and their agency to realize certain outcomes. There's a lot of interest in keeping things invisible. And by trying to prod into that, by trying to make these things visible, sometimes you come across resistance. And as you come across resistance, you may be tempted to cut corners, to do unethical things, right? Because if you announce yourself upfront, sometimes you can be blocked, right? So a lot of PEA practitioners, they are really faced with real challenges in this. For example, I was working on one project, in South Africa, looking at expanded public works program. So this is a program that employs people that are not employed for just a fraction of the month, and then they pay them some allowances, some stipends. So this is really has to do with enabling people to own their own development process, to participate in the corrective measures and the implementation of certain projects. So most of the public works that are being done is people cleaning up their own environment, helping repair streets and stuff like this, So it's not really a permanent employment, but it also helps people to alleviate things like unemployment effects and, little bit of get a little bit of income, But because this is a public program, one thing that we realized already as a research team, as an evaluation team, was that there was incentive by the political elite to claim to capture this process for their own political gains, right? So when different coalition comes into power, then they move around the number of beneficiaries. They move them aside and they put their own beneficiaries that will likely vote for them, in the forthcoming elections. So it become very difficult sometimes to look at this the situation from a technical perspective without factoring in all these political dimensions that are happening, right? So what we thought, right, because we already had appreciated in visiting different countries, already had appreciated that this is what is happening. So we thought that maybe for our client, right, who was also a government department, would clarify our purpose to the audience upfront, right? We'll clarify what we're trying to do upfront, right? So by clarifying the purpose upfront, of course, we're ruffling a bit of feathers, but at least it protects us from doing something that is, unethical, right? But also by clarifying your purpose upfront, sometimes this is a problem with even researchers. Sometimes when you clarify your objectives upfront, your real objective of a study upfront, people can then manipulate their answers. You don't know whether you are getting real situation answers or you're getting manipulated answers, because people are trying to tell you what they think you want to hear, So these are some of the downside, of course, of clarifying your purpose and also stating the audience that you are trying to reach upfront, to set disclosures, dissemination, and follow-up protocols appropriate to sensitivity and use, right? So once you do that, you make sure that you keep the process as transparent as possible. Keep all the stakeholders, the steering committee, the steering team involved and informed of some of the challenges that you are having. So keep on that communication loop very vibrant and very up to date, right? And the other thing is also depending on the context that you're engaging in, right? Sometimes as program officials or even M&E experts and practitioners, sometimes you go to contexts that you're really not familiar with. So sometimes it is important maybe to involve local experts, who will then also enable you to navigate some of these networks without really raising a lot of unnecessary eyebrows. So maybe these are the two things that I would say: clarify your purpose and your actors, and and keep the communication loop very open and very dynamic, but also try and involve the local experts and the local partners in whatever you're doing, so that you are enabled also to navigate some of these constraining aspects.
All right, considering that the level in PA contains sensitivity, transparency, and clarifications, therefore, in your case, how do you triangulate political economy data to avoid confirmation bias or selective interpretation?
Again, this is a classic PA issue, because, like I said, you are trying to, especially when you're applying PEA to monitoring evaluation, to evaluation studies. So you are trying to make visible what sometimes a lot of political actors would like to keep hidden, right? And most often than not, most of the evaluation commissioners are political powers themselves who have got stake in the game, right? So they want to keep certain, they want you to go to certain places and not to certain places, because they want to use and appropriate the evaluation report for their own political gain, right? So they're not doing this to be transparent, to be accountable. They are doing this to appear, because politics is a game of appearance. They are doing this to appear to be doing the right things, to have the documentation, right? So how do you then, as a PEA practitioner, how do you then navigate all this, and not only say the obvious, right? So one thing that, of course, there's no complete, answer to this, at least from my own experience. But one thing is to try and triangulate maybe different perspectives, the perspectives from different levels, right, of that context. Look at the macro, the sector, and the problem context, right? So because there are different actors in these different levels, you may get different. You may be able to unearth the dynamics that are coming out from there, right? In as much, because if you stay with the actors in one sector and listen to only what they tell you, and we are not also engaging with different actors, then you may not pick up these contradictions, these dynamisms that are happening. So I feel like this cross cutting analysis can also help you somehow not to be selective in your analysis, and to avoid this confirmation bias, because you are inevitably going to unearth something that you're not expecting if you look at the problem from these different levels. Yeah, but on the other hand, really, like I say, it's context by context kind of situation, because at the end of the day, you are trying also to provide a credible output in terms of the evaluation report, right? So as a qualitative researcher, for me, one of the tools that I use is iteration, go over, processes, institutions, agents, go over these aspects over and over, right? And keep the process keep your reflexivity, your own baggage, rather your own background baggage, what you think you know about the context, what you're interested in, your own frustrations, keep them visible, and try and bracket them out from contaminating maybe the data that you are collecting. So for me, these are some of the things that really I try to do, to keep the process iterative, consult as many people as I can, and also be reflexive of my own issues and on my own biases. Yeah, so I think this is how I'm going to answer this, Inai.
Right, awesome. And I think that would be another tips and tricks for us in the future. Okay, now Max, we are entering the final segment. So what advice would you give to organizations or governments who are starting to use PEA to strengthen their policymaking and M&E process?
Yeah, so keep the basics. I think that's the advice I would say, and by that I mean PA tries to make visible the agents, the institutions, the structures that are in place, right? How these are interacting, how these are being appropriated to produce and reproduce the context or the problem that we're trying to deal with, right? Who is doing what, and what kind of power do they have? What kind of incentives do they have? What are the rules that are there, and how are these rules being manipulated or used in an informal way to make sure that maybe certain outcomes persist, right? So for me, define your audience, right? Define your audience. The stakeholder analysis, of course, is standard in M&E research, and even in policy analysis, public policy analysis, you're talking about policy communities, right? Define them, make them visible, right? And then you can then look at their values, their incentives. What is the normative structure? What is the normative elements in their standpoint, so that you may know what is the entry point, what is visible, what is feasible in terms of programs, in terms of realizing change. So define your audience, and then make sure that you make all these elements visible. And then the iteration, make it iterative, right? Make it iterative. So PA is not a static, it's not a linear process. It is an iterative process. It's a cycle, so you have to, because the context continuously changes, right? If you are dealing with a 18 months program, or you're doing a 5-year program, for example, the agents are not going to remain the same. They are always going to be changing. And as they change, they also change the power dynamics. They also change the agency. They also change the institutions at the formal level, but also at the informal level. So make sure that you trace that. So your operation also should be iterative. And then, of course, you also need to build a local ownership. This is also a standard program design and policy, public policy. Build local ownership and local grounding, right? Engage a leadership, engage different actors, beneficiaries, and leadership from across the levels of analysis, from the macro level, from the sector level, and also from the agency level. Because sometimes in some contexts, depending on the structural components, you may find that what happens at the local problem level actually has its genesis at the sector level or at the macro, national, or country level. So be conversant with all these levels, moving across up and down these levels. So this is what I would say.
That's a very valuable advice, and I would say lessons to all of us here. And I think it's also applicable to other M&E practitioners out there. And before we end this session, do you have a closing statement for our MONEV podcast listeners?
Yeah, so the closing statement, Inaya, again, I will appreciate also having me here. And just to discuss this. And I would say PEA is a framework of thinking, right? This is a framework of seeing things, right? Because sometimes as M&E practitioners, sometimes we can be very technical, we can look at our technical tools, and sometimes assume that the context will somehow make way for our technicality, technical expertise or technical designs. But it's the other way around, right? It's the other way around. Context, we have to understand context in order for us to create designs that are feasible, designs that can actually work, right? And sometimes it's also very important for us to be cognizant that we can never do everything, right? We cannot change everything, even if we want, change in a particular sector, in a particular problem area, in a particular context. We may not change everything, right? So we have to. PA gives us the tools to appreciate what can change and what cannot change, right? Be it agents, be it institutions, be it the structural value, be it the incentive structure, be it how the power dynamics, right? How power is being used or manipulated. Sometimes we need to craft our programs and our evaluation designs around these contextual structures. So this is what I would say to M&E experts out there.
Wow, that's very inspiring and insightful, Max. I would just say thank you very much for joining us today. I hope that we can have more episodes in the future and perhaps talking about other topics.
Thank you so much, Inaya. Sure, let's have more. Let's have more of this. Yes.
Yes, absolutely. And that's the end of our MONEV podcast for this episode. Hopefully, our casual chat in this episode can provide knowledge to all of you. And before I end this episode, don't forget to check out the previous episodes to get important and up-to-date informations and educations about monitoring and evaluation. See you in the next episode.